Hey guys, so today I'm going to teach you how I tried to make my own oil paint. Listed here are all of the supplies that I used, and I decided to try to make my own oil paint because oil paint's very expensive and it's something that I've always wanted to learn how to paint with, but I've just never been able to afford oil paints. So I decided I would try to make my own, and I would try to make my own affordably. So I researched the two main ingredients, which are linseed oil and some sort of paint pigment. Now, I read another article saying that eyeshadow and paint pigment had a lot of the same ingredients, so I decided to try some eyeshadow that I already had, so the only thing that I had to purchase was the oil. So I started by putting a little bit of oil on the plate and then grinding a little bit of the eyeshadow into the oil and then mixing it together. And I did this multiple times and kind of tested multiple times to get the closest and the best consistency that I could get. Now, prior to doing this, I had purchased one oil paint so I could see the texture that it was supposed to be and experience like how it dried and kind of practice how to paint with that. And so what I discovered with this paint that I was trying to make is that no matter what ratio I tried to do, the texture was always a little bit off. And I think it's largely due to the fact that I used eyeshadow instead of an actual paint pigment. So the paints never fully dried down. I left it out to dry for days and it never fully dried, so that was a little bit frustrating. And the paints turned out kind of creamier and oilier than oil paints are, and that was also frustrating. It turned out a lot more like a liquid lipstick than like an oil paint. So I tested each of the paints on the piece of paper until I got the closest and the best color that I could get. And I mixed everything with something called a palette knife, which is that little knife you see there. And it's what artists use to mix all sorts of paints. So right now I'm getting out a pill container, which is what I've decided to store the paints in because it has enough space and slots in it for me to store the paint well. And so I put the paint in with the palette knife, getting as much of the product up as I could and into the pill container, and then I labeled it the color that it was with a piece of tape. Now, learning how to paint with these was quite tricky because it's not even like the oil paint that I had painted with previously. It was like painting with lipstick, honestly, so it was a little tricky, and it was a little bit of a letdown because I really kind of expected this to work super well, but it didn't. But I was still able to create a painting at the end and still able to make art with it, so that was really fun. So here I just wiped off the plate and I did the same thing all over again with the blue. Now if you'll notice, because I put on the oil first and the pigment second, the paint turned out a little bit chunky kind of and not as smooth as I wanted it to. So for the next color, I decided to grind the pigment and the eyeshadow before adding in the oil, so I was able to get the eyeshadow down to a much more fine powder, and then by adding in the oil I was able to get a much more smooth texture. And if you'll look at where I swatched it, you can see that the green is a lot more smooth and it just goes on a lot better than the red and the blue did, and so I decided to do that for the rest of the colors as well. Another challenge that I faced with these eyeshadows was that sometimes after I added the oil, it turned out to be a different color than I expected. So you'll see here with the yellow, once I add the oil, it turns into a bit of a burnt orange color, which is not quite what I was expecting. I was expecting it to be a lot more yellow, and so that was a little frustrating. And so to work around that, I just added less eyeshadow so that the paint had more oil so that it was less orange and more yellow. So here I am just painting the final art piece. I decided to paint a sunset with water because it's one of the only like scenes I could find that would use up all of the colors that I had created, and so I used various mixtures of brushes and techniques. I even used my fingers to blend at some point. I used some paper towels just to try to create a piece of art with the paints that I had created, whether they were comparable to oil paints or not. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is my final project on attempting to make my oil paint.